one of the other things I wanted to talk about, which actually we just sort of got into, was the cultural gravitation toward the eternal present, and what it means, what it would mean for us to get back in touch with this concept of timefulness, right? Like this, everything is full of time. We are all products of our pasts. Every object, every natural habitat is a product of its past. And timelessness is actually like a falsehood, right? We live in this eternal present. We don't think about the past. We don't think about the long future, thinking about, climate change. So Martina, I wanted you to talk a little bit about cathedral thinking. I think this is the perfect opportunity to think about that a little bit.
Definitely. Very interesting for me also, because I operate in the futures industry. So we always think about the future, and it's a bit of a broken system, because I always feel that if you want to project your thoughts in the future, you need to look at the present, and you need to look at the past and connect and create an history, a narrative that's super important. But in our industry, we have this obsession for the future, for the innovation, and looking forward, and we don't realize that actually the future is an object of the present and of the past. So I think that's very important. Cathedral thinking is a very interesting concept. So to define it a bit, so we're all on the same page, this is a bit of a Western perspective, because it's a principle that existed also in indigenous communities as the 7th generation thinking. So cathedral thinking is inspired to like a medieval approach to construction, when kings or the church was building like a building, for example, a church, a palace, a monument. And the way the team, the constructor, the builders, everybody would work about it is to project in the future. So plan for 100, 200, 300 years in the future. So it really challenged, opposite to what we just talked about, it really challenged the idea of like short-termism and look at long-termism. So when this team was starting to plan and construct these buildings, these projects, they will think at the implication of this element, this building, in 100 or 200 or 300 years in the future. And they will build resilience to face potential future challenges or implications in the future. For example, next to a church, they will plant a forest. So in 100 years or 200 years, when restoration work needed to be done, they would have trees, they will have like wood to be able to restore the church. So this idea of like long-term means, which doesn't mean thinking only about the future, but also think about the past and the present, but also prepare for the future and think about potential challenges, implications in the future of what we are doing now. So that's a bit in a nutshell cathedral thinking. And in the report I developed, I analyzed how this way of thinking is almost completely absent in business, especially in like product and design development, and how thinking like this enables a company, a designer, a creative to really expand their thinking and implement the needs of the wider society, including the society of the future, in what they are producing, designing, ideating now.
Yeah. One of the things I think a lot about in selling futures work to clients is that they're so often rotated off a piece of business, or they're rotated into a new role, and so they don't care about the future. The long term is not their concern, and it's so interesting. In that context, it's unfortunate. But when you think about a context like, to bring it back to climate change that Ruth brought up, you need to create urgency, but you also need to create a view of the long term, and that you need to be able to connect the urgency to the long term. And I think that is such a difficult thing for people. It's such a foreign concept for so many people to be able to think about, the world when you're gone, because that's what those builders and kings and people were doing. They were building a church for a world that they didn't exist in. So I think that's such an interesting problem to face. And I don't know, Ruth, if you've done any specific research in regards to that climate change sort of piece of it.
So I think what's super interesting interesting about the climate change example is that we sort of have this competing narratives of time. So one is that this is an emergency, okay? It's an emergency, it's a crisis. But you could say, well, how long can something be an emergency? How long can something be a crisis? We're talking, obviously, for some people, the effects of climate change are now and they're present and they're already in their past, but for many people, they're in the future. So how do we think really carefully, I think, about the language that we use in relation to climate change to make sure that we don't undermine arguments of urgency and undermine arguments of crisis by implying that something is now, or it's imminent, or it's just around the corner, when for some people it might be further down the line. So I think we have to be very careful about the types of language we use. And one of the ways in which we can try and do that is to try and make people aware of the circumstances that are changing in their own environment. So I think so much of the climate narrative is based on talking about places which are often very far away as an imagined future for us, or a potential future for us. And what we actually need to be thinking about, well, what are the natural changes in our own ecology? What are the things that you're noticing in your own life? So how do we bring these really big timescales into people's own day-to-day existence? Because if we can do that, then we're much more likely to be able to motivate people to make the small changes that they need. If we constantly talk to people about very distant potential outcomes, I think that the point that you made about you're asking people to imagine a world beyond their lifespan, for most people, this is not only is it super hard, but it's not something we want to do. Like, I don't want to think about the world beyond my death. Like, that means I'm not here. It's really difficult. So we need to try and bring maybe some of the arguments into our own lived experience now to make people more motivated, to make people more engaged.